Islamic resurgence. And so you had things like middle-class people that had benefited from development adopting a new interest in Islam and learning about Islam. You saw a marked increase in people making the Hajj pilgrimage. The practice of Islamic piety in public places really developed in a kind of very robust way. And so when I went to Indonesia in the early 2000s, one of the things that I was interested in was how Islam was engaging with the legacy of Indonesian development on the one hand, and the fact that this very poor country was increasingly becoming a middle-income country, and on the other hand, what Islamic political participation had to do with it. So where I ended up doing the fieldwork initially was at this steel factory in Western Java. If you can think of Indonesia, it's this chain of islands coming off of Southeast Asia. Bangladesh is up here, then you have Thailand, Malaysia, and then Indonesia kind of spreading out from the Indian Ocean off into the Pacific. So I was working in Java, which is a main island, and one of the very interesting things that I found there was, this was a company that had really benefited from state investment during this period of development. And one of the things that, but one of the problems they were having is that as this political transformation was taking place, the state support for the company was declining. And so I was very interested in how Islam could be remobilized in this context. And one of the things that I found that was very interesting was that as they were preparing for this privatization and this transformation from a state-supported company to one that would be more market-oriented and dependent on commercial transactions in the so-called free market, was that they were discovering a renewed sense of Islamic identity. And they were introducing Islamic ideas about productivity, efficiency, corporate performance, and so forth, all within the language and the idiom of Islam. And it's very interesting listening to Brother Rehan's excellent talk. One of the things that they would emphasize were precisely these types of ideas. That, Islam was very pro-business. It was about entrepreneurship and risk-taking and so forth. And they would say things like, actually the first businessman was the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He took these risks. He was a trader. I remember some of the people I was interviewing would say things like, the Prophet, he owned 40 camels. And today that would be like owning 40 BMWs. This type of thing, right? And so it's really interesting because, and what I found fascinating about this articulation was the fact that if you read the narrative in the West, in many parts of the West, not all, but the idea is that somehow Islam looks to the past. That Islam looks to, history and this kind of thing, and is backward looking. But what this articulation showed in this work I was doing, this research I was doing in Indonesia, was actually that Muslims were taking the resources of Islam and trying to reformulate them in order to deal with really pressing questions that were pressing questions of economy, of the contemporary globalization, of how are we going? What resources do we have available in order to make Islam speak to the concerns of development, commercial success, business, and so forth? And so I got very excited about that. I wrote a book that I called Spiritual Economies. And this book really analyzed how these principles were being put into practice. These principles of productivity, and how they were taking ideas from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Islamic history, and reformulating them to make them a recipe for commercial success in the modern world. And so I finished that work up, and I think people appreciated it because this is in the wake of September 11th, all the geopolitical conflicts that have been taking place, and it really was an attempt to, in some sense, reformulate the narrative, to say that, look, I don't actually think we understand Islam as well as we think we do. I think, many people assume today that they know what Islam is. I'm not talking about people in this room, I'm talking about maybe people outside this room. The kind of media narratives of the clash of civilizations and these types of things. I say, actually, it's much more complicated than that. That there's really multiple ways of practicing Islam, and there are people that are actually really seriously thinking about, what is there in Islam that can make us address the problems, the pressing issues that we face today, and really trying to draw on those historical and cultural resources in order to address the demands of the day. So I wrote that. The book, it did okay. It got some publicity, not as much as I would have liked, of course. More influential was this guy Timur Karan, who sorry, I'm just going to try to find this here. Who came out with a book, actually right after I published this book called Spiritual Economies. He came out with a book called The Long Divergence. Have people encountered this? Anyone heard of this book, The Long Divergence? Yeah. And he argued basically, this was right around the time of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, that in fact Islamic law, fiqh, and Sharia were holding back the Middle East. And that the reason for Islamic underdevelopment was fiqh and Islamic law and these types of things. And that argument became, of course, very popular, very powerful, because it tapped into this already existing narrative that I think exists in the world that, Islam looks to the past, that it's backward, and so forth. And unfortunately, he was the person that got written up in the New York Times, The Economist, The New Yorker. I was talking to my publisher and I was like, really you should be getting out there and showing my book because I'm destabilizing the narrative. But we all know how hard that is to do. That people often they look to ideas that confirm what they already believe, and I think that's a lot of the misunderstanding of Islam today. So how did I then come to Islamic finance? Well, about this time, I would come back and I would give talks on this research that I had done in Indonesia, and a lot of people would come up to me and they would say, well, this is really interesting. We really like this, but what does this have to do with Islamic banking? And I would say, well, actually, I don't really know. I don't know anything about Islamic finance. I don't know anything about Islamic banking. But I had done a little bit of work while I was living in Indonesia in the early 2000s and interviewed some very small community-level Islamic banks, some people there, and I was trying to understand it, and they would keep saying to me, well, this is banking, but we don't have interest. And I'd think to myself, well, how is that even possible? How could you even have a bank without interest? I mean, what does that even look like? So I started getting more and more interested in this, and I had a big network, a bunch of colleagues in Indonesia that I thought I could work with on this question. And they said to me, well, Indonesia's a good place for this, but really the place you need to go to is Malaysia, because they're really moving forward on this question. So toward the late end of the 2000s, I started thinking, well, maybe I should really take this up and think of this. And I looked at the articulation of Islam with corporate practices, human resources management practices, various iterations of self-help. And I said, well, maybe I'll take this up as a kind of second book project. I'll just show you, since we're here. This is a picture of the first book. This is the guy, Ari Ginanja, a really brilliant guy, who I spent a lot of time with, and he was the one that was articulating this message of that being a better Muslim could be more conducive to business success. So I took up this question of, wow, Islamic finance, go to Malaysia. So I went to Malaysia for the first time back in about 2010, and I just found it absolutely fascinating. There was a lot of really interesting stuff going on. And what was perhaps most interesting was that the Malaysian state, starting in the early 2000s, had made a concerted effort to make Malaysia what one of the participants in my research called the New York of the Muslim world. Now, what does that mean, the New York of the Muslim world? Well, the idea was that you would have a center for Islamic finance that would be a kind of Islamic Wall Street, that would operate according to Islamic norms and Islamic practices and observant of the Sharia, of the fiqh, but distinct from what they call conventional finance, right? Conventional finance that we know so well, you know, the finance of New York, of Toronto, of RBC and CIMB and these other banks. So I said, wow, that's really interesting. You know, what does that mean? What does it mean to be the New York of the Muslim world? And it turned out it meant a lot of things. It's really built on a project that started back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Malaysian state, at this time under the former Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, had started to think about the problem of Islam and modernity. And the idea of, what does a modernizing, developmentalist Islamic state look like? That, and how do we create an economy, a polity, a society that is simultaneously observant of Islamic religious practices on the one hand, but also can engage with the global economy, with questions of development, with questions of modernization on the other hand. And so what Mahathir did at that time was, there had been, as I'm sure many of you will know, back in the 1970s, there have been some experiments in Islamic finance. Perhaps most notable was the Mit Gamar Bank in Egypt from the 1960s. A number of other Islamic banks came about in the 1970s, supported mainly by some of the wealthy families in the Middle East. And what Mahathir did is he sent these study teams out, and they would go to Sudan, to Egypt, to parts of the Gulf, and they would kind of learn about, well, what is Islamic finance, how should it work, and whatnot. And they started very small. They here's a couple of Islamic banks. The first bank they started in Malaysia is called Bank Islam. It started in 1983, and this was a kind of result of these study groups that had gone out and tried to figure out, well, what would actually Islamic banking look like in practice? How would it operate? How would it work? So they started this bank, and it started very small, but it grew quickly. And they said, well, we'll give you 10 years, you'll be the only Islamic bank, and then we'll start developing further. So Bank Islam was the first bank. Then after about 10 years, in the early 90s, they started something called Bank Muamalat. There were 2 Islamic banks in the country. And then in the late 90s, Mahathir said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to require all the conventional banks to open up these Islamic arms. And so you really had this explosion. And by the early 2000s, you had a situation in which, actually really unique in the world, that there was this basically a functioning Islamic banking system in Malaysia operating in parallel alongside the conventional banking system. And you had these global banks like HSBC opening up Islamic arms, HSBC Amana and so forth. CIMB is the second largest Islamic bank in Malaysia, has an Islamic arm. ATMs everywhere, you see these in train stations and whatnot. And you really get Standard Chartered Bank also has their Sadiq arm, so you have this Islamic arm. This is very common in Malaysia. And they really offer a whole suite of services that are equivalent to the services that are offered in conventional banks. So you can go in and get a Sharia-compliant home mortgage, for example. Or you can get, this is actually Al-Rajhi Bank, which was invited to operate in Malaysia, I think in around 2010 or so. It's a Saudi bank. They call themselves the world's largest Islamic bank. They're operating now in Malaysia, have many branches in many different cities, all over Kuala Lumpur and other big cities in Malaysia. You can get a Islamic insurance policy, a takaful policy very easily. Here's Takaful Malaysia, is the first Islamic insurance company. One of the things that the Malaysian state did was very, I think, unique, was that they realized that you couldn't just have a banking system. That you had to have a whole suite of financial services, because financial services are so intertwined. You can't have an insurance industry without a banking industry. And in order to create an Islamic financial industry, you needed to have Islamic insurance and figure out what that meant, what kind of principles that would operate under, as opposed to conventional insurance, which often looks haram because it looks like gambling, right? It looks like excessive risk. There's excessive risk in insurance. So you have to figure out ways of doing kind of mutual contracts and whatnot that would enable the guarantees to work in accordance with Islamic norms. So you see these all over the place. You know, Islamic credit cards are very easy to get in Malaysia today, and so forth. Kuwait Finance House is another Islamic bank that operates very widely in Malaysia. I think it's really interesting because they use they don't use the term bank, right? See, this is, I think, one of the things we often have to think about when we change the discourse is, well, what does a bank mean? What is a bank actually? Can you have a bank that isn't based on interest? And so this Kuwaiti firm, Kuwait Finance House, they actually change the language that we use, right? They don't call it Kuwait Islamic Bank, they call it Kuwait Finance.